Welcome to INFOWARS Nightly News and this vitally important Thursday edition. We're going to go to the Nightly News with Darren McBreen in one moment, but first, this breaking news alert. I have talked to multiple members of the Border Patrol and former members. We have also talked to multiple medical doctors, one of them who went on record today on my syndicated radio broadcast and had this to say.
Well, a friend of mine that's a resident at Truman Medical Center, which is where I did my residency at, called me and said, "Hey, we've got a possible Ebola patient here, and he's bleeding out of all of it. I'm not going to use the language he used, but he's bleeding out of all of his orifices. He's in septic shock, hypotensive, high fever. He was visiting Africa, or he was from Africa, I believe, and had recently been here in the Kansas City area." They took care of him in the ICU. Of course, it was not a rapid test, so they weren't sure, but I think they ordered the test and they sent it off, and they moved him to the ICU and they put him in isolation. The following day, he called me back and said they disappeared the patient. I said, "What do you mean they disappeared him?" He said, "The patient's gone." They were told that he left AMA, which means against medical advice, but the guy he wouldn't have been able to leave. I mean, he was in that bad of a shape. The following day, they had a meeting with anybody that had contact with that patient and said that he did not have Ebola, he had malaria. That's when we heard that all these other cases in these other cities, they were coming back and saying, no, they didn't have Ebola, they had malaria. That seemed like that was that's what they were told to tell everybody. Well, then we had a second patient at Research Medical Center that was rumored to have, because I have friends there too, and they called me and said we have a possible Ebola patient. That patient disappeared. There's a patient more recently at KU Medical Center, which is just just across on the Kansas side, about 20 minutes from here. And that patient, I don't know what the status of that patient is, but they came out and said that he didn't have Ebola, but he had typhoid. So something very, very strange is going on. And I wouldn't have thought much about it, but this is happening in other areas of the country, not only in Kansas City. These patients are disappearing. They're doing something with the patients, and God knows where they're going.
That was Dr. James Lorenzi saying exactly what I was told by a major medical manager who's a medical doctor in Dallas who I've known for at least a year, but he was scared to go public. We also have sources in North Carolina and many other areas that are inside hospitals saying that they're clearly covering up Ebola patients and secretly quarantining them or disappearing them. That's exactly what Zach Taylor, retired former senior Border Patrol agent and the head of the Retirees Union, said 2 months ago, and what he told us back on October 10th.
The agents are telling us that they're seeing some people that are obviously sick with shivering type illnesses, with possibly dehydrating illnesses like diarrhea and vomiting. But those people are disappearing. We don't know what they have, where they're going, where they're taking them. Surely they're being quarantined somewhere. We just don't know where. And even the agents don't know what the diagnosis is of these illnesses.
That story and video is at Infowars.com as well. We know that just 2 nurses in Dallas who came in contact with an Ebola patient ended up getting it. Do we really believe that's where it stopped? We know they're telling firefighters and police that they need to use codes and don't use the word Ebola.
Yeah, I'm just calling to confirm the earlier reports that you had about how we're dispatched to a call where there's possible Ebola, that they do not want to say Ebola over the air. And they will say for our agency quotes, they have positive answers to additional screening questions, which our dispatchers ask to the patient.
So government is keeping the borders open, flying in unlimited West Africans from countries literally collapsing under Ebola. We have people dying on New York flights from West Africa, vomiting to death. And before they're even tested, the news tells us no Ebola, nothing to see here, go back to sleep. They're telling the medical doctors and other personnel around the country, say that it is some other illness out of Africa. Say that it's something other than Ebola, even though the supposed symptoms of the diseases that they're claiming it really is don't match those of Ebola. And what we're seeing in these patients are things that are consistent with Ebola, and the medical professionals believe that a cover-up is taking place. Please visit INFOWARS.com so you can see the full, unedited interview that aired live today on my radio show and read the articles and the backstory to fully understand what's happening in these two different reports. Missouri doctor, suspected Ebola patient witnessed bleeding out of all orifices. Hospital altered patient diagnosis to stave off public panic? ? Another headline, medical professional, health authorities may be covering up Ebola cases in U.S. But here's what we know is happening. Exclusive, patients being disappeared to prevent panic. That's what we were told by former and current Border Patrol has been going on for months. So there's clearly a cover-up going. They're clearly telling firefighters and police to say it's not Ebola. They're telling healthcare workers to shut up. This is a very serious situation as they continue the flights in from West Africa. The big question is, where are these people being taken, and why do criminal elements of the federal government want Ebola to spread, not just here, but in places like Madrid, Spain? Why did they violate the default of never bring Ebola patients into your country and block flights from countries when there's an outbreak and do screenings? That question and a lot more will be examined as we officially kick off INFOWARS Nightly News straight ahead with Darren McBreen sitting in this chair. Stay with us.
Tonight, what's it going to take to contain the Ebola outbreak? And the origins of ISIS revealed. That's next on the INFOWARS Nightly News.
Absolute brainwashing with a public that doesn't even know who the players are. The Council on Foreign Relations last year had the headline, Why We Need Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in Iraq 4 years ago was allowed to set up bases in the west of Iraq.
Recently, the United States military accidentally airdropped a pallet of weapons and supplies to ISIS terrorists in Syria. A huge mistake, according to U.S. officials who are claiming that the weapons were intended for Kurdish forces defending the besieged and strategically important Syrian city of Kobani. So far, the U.S. air campaign that's being played up as a heroic gesture by the corporate media, well, it's not really working out too well. ISIS has yet to retreat. The offensive against Kobani continues, and although there has been some isolated strikes that have killed ISIS terrorists, the majority of airstrikes in Syria have killed thousands of civilians, including women and children, not to mention the fact that the U.S. airstrikes largely increase an already serious refugee crisis in the country, because when your house gets burned down, you no longer have a place to live. That's usually how that works. But was the airdrop of weapons and supplies to ISIS really a mistake? After all, it's always been the ultimate goal of the United States and its allies to put boots on the ground in Syria and to remove al-Assad from power. The mistaken airdrop could be used as an excuse to send in U.S. ground forces. But wait a minute. Why on earth would the U.S. government purposely give ISIS terrorists weapons? I mean, these are the same Muslim extremists who are going around beheading journalists and executing Christians right now. Do you mean to tell me the U.S. government is so corrupt, that they're so evil, that they would actually do something like that? Oh, yes, they would. And the evidence is overwhelming. In fact, the pallet of weapons that has supposedly ended up in the wrong hands, what's really insignificant compared to the total ISIS arsenal. Not only does ISIS have in their possession tons of weaponry taken from the retreating Iraqi forces, but the terrorist army now has long-range artillery and thousands of automatic weapons, courtesy of the good old USA. Now, I know that some of you don't want to hear about this right now, and I'll admit that it's a tough pill to swallow, but we all need to wake up and understand what's really going on right now. The U.S. State Department is coordinating uprisings throughout the entire Middle East. These nations have been deliberately targeted for destabilization, and ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, is an American creation.
The West didn't want stable, secular, upright, prosperous Middle Eastern countries. There was a major school of that there going back to the time of Egypt and before. So when you hear about Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter, quote, creating al-Qaeda and having them attack the Russians, they didn't create them. There was a relationship going back to British intelligence before that, again, specifically in Afghanistan, not just in Saudi Arabia. And so when we then see Obama caught with Benghazi, giving 15,000 surface-to-air IMPAD missiles that can shoot down aircraft all day long, and all these other weapons to the al-Qaeda rebels in Syria, and the whole thing that's happened in Iraq, all of it has been orchestrated by the globalists in D.C., in London, in Tel Aviv, in Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. And so there is no debating that the people running our government planned this whole deal. This war against ISIS is totally staged. The only reason it's happening is that there's such public education now about who really runs this and that it's al-Qaeda. They changed the name 2 or 3 times to IS, to ISIS, back to IS, now to the Caliphate, back to the Caliphate, to confuse you. It's just absolute brainwashing with a public that doesn't even know who the players are. Al-Qaeda in Iraq 4 years ago was allowed to set up bases in the west of Iraq and invade eastern Syria. They started the civil war 4 years ago in Syria. They were given massive funding. They're 65%, according to NATO, of the rebel force. The Council on Foreign Relations last year had the headline, "Why We Need Al-Qaeda." And they said, give them air support to take over the country and we'll remove them later. Boom.
That's right. These are clandestine operations orchestrated by the CIA to take over Middle Eastern governments. The United States used al-Qaeda example to take over Libya. And remember, it was Senator John McCain, when he went into Benghazi, he was there to campaign for financial and military support for the militants who were fighting Muammar Gaddafi. And well, what happened to that money? That money and those weapons, they actually ended up in the hands of al-Qaeda.
We may actually have the photographic evidence of the handshakes that set those deals in motion.
Well, yeah, Marcos, pull that up. I want to take a look at that. Here's John McCain standing next to a known al-Qaeda leader. But I guess when he's standing next to John McCain, they call him a pro-democracy rebel. Yeah, you like that name? That sounds like something George Orwell would have come up with. Marcos, what's his real name?
It says his name is Abdel Hakim Belhaj. He's a known al-Qaeda leader. It's well known that we've been funding destabilization campaigns in these developing regions for long periods of time. They made a whole movie about it starring Tom Hanks. So if you have any qualms or if you have any questions about whether or not the government's actually doing this, they have been. We send people in to destabilize the region and then turn them into an enemy that gets us in the region to take control.
That's right. And McCain, pictured there, caught with his pants down. I mean, we are giving Muslim extremists billions of dollars in weapons, cash, and equipment. Like I said, and like you said, Marcos, this is to destabilize the region. The CIA arms al-Qaeda. They create ISIS to go in there and butcher Christians, behead journalists, to the point where the American people start demanding that we finally go in there and do something about it. And ISIS wasn't created overnight. The United States has a long history of arming terrorists. And there's always the blowback factor as well. And that usually comes back to bite us in the ass.
The people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago.
Spoken like a true insider. Hey, we're going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, Dan Dix is going to join us from Ottawa, where Parliament